One of the great enduring mysteries of the classical world is the location of the tomb of Marc Antony and Cleopatra Philopater. It's referenced in numerous sources from classical antiquity, notably Plutarch's Life of Antony and Suetonius' Roman History, and we have further references to it in the late 2nd century AD. So this tomb was attested in multiple sources, and the Romans were certainly aware of its existence and probably its location. Today, however, that location is basically lost, despite ongoing attempts to find it. So what I want to do in this video is look at the evidence that we have for this tomb, and then explore the two proposed locations for where this structure could possibly be located. Our evidence for the tomb is essentially literary evidence. After the Battle of Actium, when Cleopatra and Marc Antony were defeated by Octavian and his forces, they first attempted negotiations with allies and other powers in the eastern Mediterranean, but eventually, they retreated back to the Egyptian capital at Alexandria. Plutarch, in his Life of Antony, tells us that Octavian's forces invaded Egypt in 30 BC and laid siege to Alexandria, and many of Antony's forces then defected. Antony, quite understandably, did not know what to do when this happened, and he flew into a rage. Cleopatra, in turn, fled to her tomb, which was built near a temple of Isis, and barred the doors out of fear of Antony, who blamed her, and then sent messengers to Antony stating that she was dead. Antony, distraught at hearing this, ordered his slave to kill him, but his slave took his own life instead. So Antony was then compelled to fall on his own sword, but he didn't die. He then got word that Cleopatra was, in fact, not dead, and wanted Antony by her side. So, bleeding out, Antony was carried to the tomb, and he told Cleopatra that she would be able to trust Proculius, one of Octavian's companions, above all others. But Proculius attempted to capture Cleopatra because Octavian wanted the queen present in his future triumph. And then, after botched negotiations, Cleopatra took her own life. According to Plutarch, this was by having an asp bite her. And Octavian, while angry at her death, allowed Cleopatra to be buried in her tomb alongside Antony. Cassius Dio, in Book 51 of his Roman History, tells approximately the same account. After Actium, Octavian spent some time overseeing regional affairs and consolidating his gains, settling veterans, many absorbed from Antony's defected forces, attending to some religious duties and observations, and founding a city on the site of his victory, which was called Nicopolis. Cleopatra went to Egypt and was concerned about a coup or at least a revolt, and she claimed that she had won a great victory. Antony eventually went to Africa in an attempt to get an army, led by Pinarius Scarpus, which ostensibly existed to defend Egypt from that direction. That army, though, was not forthcoming, and Antony then fled back to Alexandria. They attempted to gather allies, raised an army, and attempted to negotiate with Octavian. Cleopatra apparently sent him a gold scepter and a gold crown, essentially offering control of Egypt. Despite these attempted negotiations, Octavian and his army still came. In fear, or at least Cassius Dio tells us it was in fear, Cleopatra fled to her tomb, sent word to Antony that she was dead, and Antony, in his sorrow, attempted to fall on his own sword. He, of course, did not die, and learned that Cleopatra was in fact alive, so he was carried to her tomb. Like Plutarch, Cassius Dio states that he had to be hoisted into the tomb, but unlike Plutarch, this account tells us that a portion of the roof was not finished, and so this is how Antony made it inside. After the fall of Alexandria, Cleopatra was permitted to embalm Antony's body, and she was then taken to the palace to speak with Octavian, and eventually asks to follow Antony in death. Cassius Dio was clear that it wasn't known how Cleopatra died. He states that there were pinpricks on her arm, and he restates the story about the asp, but he also suggests poison. Either way, the Queen of Egypt was dead, and Octavian had her body embalmed and buried in the tomb she had constructed alongside Antony. Suetonius tells us in the Lives of the 12 Caesars something a bit different. He agrees that Octavian consolidated his gains after Actium and then laid siege to Alexandria. But unlike Plutarch and Cassius Dio, Suetonius states that Antony forced Marc Antony to take his own life, and then tried to save Cleopatra's life after she had been bitten by the asp. The pair were buried in Cleopatra's tomb, and then Octavian had the incomplete tomb finished. Suetonius is very clear in telling us that Octavian visited the tomb of Alexander, where he paid his respects, and he was then asked if he wanted to see the mausoleum of the Ptolemies, to which Octavian apparently responded that he had come to see a king, meaning Alexander, and not corpses. The point here is that in Suetonius' account it appears that the mausoleum of the Ptolemies, the tomb of Cleopatra, and the tomb of Alexander are all separate structures but seem to be in the same general area. The geography of Strabo essentially restates all of this, and there isn't really much new information. And then lastly, Florus, writing after everybody else in the 2nd century, simply tells us that Antony took his own life, Cleopatra eventually took hers after going to the tomb, lying down next to Antony's body and being bitten by snakes, but he does tell us that the tomb still existed in his day. So what do all of these texts agree on? Well, the textual sources all agree that Octavian blockaded and laid siege to Alexandria, while Cleopatra and Antony were inside the city. And they all agree that Cleopatra retreated to her tomb at some point during the siege, and that Octavian permitted Antony and Cleopatra's bodies to be laid to rest there. To this day, we don't know where this tomb is. This is one of the enduring mysteries of the classical world, and there's a great deal of interest in trying to locate the final resting place of Cleopatra and Antony. In terms of what we definitely know, is that the tomb has to have been within city limits, because Cleopatra is stated to have gone to the tomb while Alexandria was under siege. It's extremely unlikely that Octavian would have allowed one of his principal rivals and enemies to freely leave Alexandria. But beyond that, we don't know. This, however, has not stopped people, both professionals and hobbyists, from attempting to locate the tomb, and attempting to locate it in areas that were not within Alexandria's ancient city limits. So with that in mind, has anything substantial ever been turned up? Well, there are basically two ideas as to where this structure may actually be. The first theory is that the tomb is either located in or somewhere near Taposiris Magna, a city founded by Ptolemy II for the Delphus around 280 BC. There probably was a town here prior to 280 BC, but once the city was founded, it became a religious center largely dedicated to the cult of Osiris, and it's the Temple of Osiris that is suggested as being the location of this tomb. So in terms of supporting evidence, what are we looking at? Well, Taposiris Magnus is approximately 50 kilometers from Alexandria, so to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely clear on why the site was selected. One of the heads of the excavations at Taposiris Magna, Kathleen Martinez, has argued that despite Egyptologists having questioned it, the story of Cleopatra being bitten by an asp and succumbing in this way is actually true. This is because Cleopatra viewed herself as the embodiment of Isis, and snakes were sacred in Egyptian religion and Eastern Mediterranean religions more broadly. And being bitten by an asp was an attempt to achieve apotheosis. Because of that, her tomb would have been located in a temple, and the Temple of Osiris at Taposiris Magna is close to Alexandria. Hence, it is the proposed location for the elusive tomb. Excavations have been taking place at this site for over 2 decades by this point, so what have the sands of Egypt turned up? There is a necropolis that was discovered here, containing 27 tombs, which appear to have architectural features dating its construction to the Roman period. The 10 mummies found here were all facing the Temple of Osiris, which has been interpreted as meaning that the temple was significant at the time of the burial. We do know from ground-penetrating radar that there are more structures in the necropolis buried beneath the sands, and a large tunnel has been discovered at the site in 2022, so the finds are still happening, but this doesn't appear to be a burial shaft. Instead, this tunnel has been interpreted as a channel dug to bring water into the complex. Besides that, there have been plenty of funerary objects, such as gold items with prayers or dedications to Osiris or Hathor written on them, as well as coins which bear the image of Cleopatra and Antony, so the coins at least seem to date to the correct period. Recently, more coins, some pottery dating to the 1st century BC, and a bust of a woman have been located at the site. Kathleen Martinez has argued, since its discovery, that the bust depicts Cleopatra, but that doesn't seem to be backed up by other specialists in the period, who instead date it to after her time fully in the Roman imperial era. So for this particular site, while we do have plenty of material evidence that there is a necropolis and that people were buried here, and that there are artifacts and remains dating to approximately the correct period, what we can say for certain is that Taposiris Magna was in use during Cleopatra's time, but we don't have solid evidence that this is her resting place. Which brings us to the other proposed location, and this is probably the more likely one, because it is in Alexandria itself. Because the surviving sources tell us that Cleopatra went to her tomb while Alexandria was under siege, the more likely location for that tomb, rather than Taposiris Magna, which is not in the city limits of Alexandria now, and was not in the city limits in the 1st century BC, is that the lost tomb is lying somewhere beneath modern Alexandria, and unfortunately we'll probably never really be able to find it for the following reason. In 365, there was an earthquake off the coast of Crete, and it devastated that island. The quake, which is estimated to maybe have been around 8.5 on the Richter scale, is probably responsible for the tsunami that Ammianus Marcellinus describes hitting Alexandria in that year. The impact of the wave was so intense that it changed the coastline of the city, and it probably caused an island to sink. This island was known to the Greeks and Romans as Antirodos, and it was situated in Alexandria's harbor. It was rediscovered in 1996 during an underwater archaeological excavation headed by Frank Gaudio. As you might expect due to its location in the ancient harbor, Antirodos is not all that big. From the expeditions undertaken in the past 3 decades or so, we know that the approximate size is 1,200 acres, just under 1.9 square miles or 4.8 square kilometers. It now lies about 5 meters beneath the waters of Alexandria's harbor, but the island existed during the late Republican period, and probably up until the earthquake in 365, and the archaeology that has been conducted has revealed that it was inhabited prior to the Hellenistic era, when Alexandria was founded, but was then subsequently leveled for new construction around 250 BC. 3 features stand out here. The first is what looks to be the remains of a fairly extensive dock on the eastern side of the island, facing the rest of the city. This was probably the main entrance on the island, not only because of the docks and its location in respect to Alexandria, but also because it was lined with several dozen columns which probably would have been visible from the shore. Moving farther inland, there are the remains of at least 2 structures relatively close to each other. The first is really just ruins and a floor, approximately 98 by 32 yards or 90 by 30 meters. The other structure is definitely a temple dedicated to Isis, which features not only a pair of sphinxes carved from granite, with the head of one probably being carved in the likeness of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, but which also has a large statue of a priest who served Isis. So with that being said, the sources which go into more detail about the tomb of Cleopatra, like Plutarch, note that it was located near a temple of Isis and near Cleopatra's palace. The second structure is probably the palace, so that then means that the likely location of the lost tomb would be on Antirodos. The overall problem, however, is that this is probably as close as we're going to get to quote-unquote hard, definitive proof of the tomb. The texts tell us that Cleopatra was able to go to her tomb while the city was under siege, apparently freely, which likely means that it was either on Antirodos, due to this also being the location of a temple of Isis, and what is probably her palace, or it was somewhere in the general area which suffered heavily under the earthquake of 365 and was either destroyed by that event, or had been looted prior to the earthquake or was destroyed after. Either way, we don't have references to it after about the 2nd century in the Roman imperial period. Antirodos is probably the best place to look for the tomb, if anything of it remains, but if it is there, it's underwater, and we are not, unfortunately, going to find the remains of Antony and Cleopatra's bodies, although we very could locate material remains of the tomb. Excavations at the other site, Taposiris Magna, have been ongoing, and a lot of artifacts and human remains have been found. We do know that it was a temple dedicated to Osiris, not Isis, and there are plenty of people buried here dating from the Roman period. So it's possible that something may one day turn up confirming that this is indeed the site of the lost tomb of Cleopatra, but as of right now, the bulk of the ancient evidence does not favor that location. For right now, the location of this structure is going to remain one of the enduring mysteries of the past. But, with more excavation, perhaps one day, that will change.